morning and welcome to the Foggy Dew. This is Colin. Well, gang, it's good to be back in the studio. I said I had a lot of content for today's show, and I certainly do. I guess I'll go ahead and just dive right into the show. I wanted to make a note. I thought it was so interesting. The United States debt, passed the $40 trillion mark on Wednesday. 40 trillion in debt. I just wanted to make a note of it because I was sitting there watching this whole thing as it was getting close. That is such a preposterous number to even think about. 40 trillion in debt. The thing that's so stunning about that number is it was like 19 trillion when Obama left office. So like in 2016, it was just 10 years ago. So Biden and Trump have doubled the debt in just 10 years. And I say Trump and Biden, it's really, those two guys are really just figureheads at parties. And that's really kind of where you need to point the dirty end of the stick is you have two totally irresponsible political parties that are both totally culpable in this. And really what you're doing is you're just choosing the lesser evil here because Republicans are totally fiscally irresponsible. And Democrats really are just insane fiscally. When you kind of peel the onion here on this whole thing with the debt, the interest on the debt, it either is right now or it soon will be the number one item on our balance sheet. The interest is the number one item, not schools, not roads, not bridges, not our military. It's our interest payments. All of this stuff that was shoved in our heads about America does everything right. We landed on the moon. We won World War II. The US government has everything under control. We are a country now in 2026 that is paying the minimum on our credit card every month, and we keep spending. And I think the challenge for the average American, like a person like myself or anybody listening to this, here's the challenge. Costs are not going to go down. Yes, if you can control oil prices out of the Strait of Hormuz, that'll help a lot. The cost of oil is going to help with absolutely everything. But if you look at how interest and debt is applied, costs of goods will not go down. And I think if you look at it and you're being pragmatic, the idea at this point with 40 trillion in debt, that tweaks to the system are going to fix this, that is a naive position to hold. We are at a point now where large-scale cuts are needed to social programs that come from the federal government. And are any of those evident? Are any of these large cuts like ready to go? No. We need those things like yesterday. We don't even have legislation drafted to seriously address this stuff. And the thing that's bothersome as a person that voted for Trump 3 times and sits here and really has no choice but to vote for Republicans, it's the only sober choice. The thing that really just galls you is that Republicans, they could have spent 2 years fixing this. We had the House, we had the Senate, we had the executive. The Republicans had a mandate to fix all these things and take the country in a different direction, and they didn't do it. They could have done this for 2 years, and they didn't. And the reason they didn't is because half of the Republican Party is as captive as the Democrat Party. So I guess, unfortunately, don't look for pricing relief anytime soon. And I just talked about legislation. No viable solution is going to pass Congress. It's like the idea that we're going to pass a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget. Yeah, that's great. You can talk about that in your sociology, political science class in college, but the practical application of it is you're never going to find a consensus majority in our legislature that's going to land legislation on the executive's desk. Not at this point, not with how calcified these parties are against each other. And the funny thing is they never pass like a 5-page bill. The only thing our Congress can do at this point is like pass these like $2,000 enormous pork bills. Like, did anybody really read the big, beautiful bill? It had that whole gun thing hidden in it. You don't even know what's in these things. None of these Congress people read this stuff. They just hear about it and you're like, oh, well, my side wants it, so I'm going to vote yes. You're not at a point where you're going to get a bunch of small bills that you're going to get consensus on that's going to fix this. There's no consensus to be found. And I guess if you move beyond the ineptness of our government, where this really becomes problematic is in a couple years, because at a certain point, you're going to have austerity measures. You're going to have austerity measures. I think we're past the point of that not being a fact. Because in 2032, so just 6 years from now, Social Security will be cut. There will be an automatic 25% cut to Social Security. We don't have any money left. And we're not going to sit here and raise the age and all these other things to make the actuaries happy. You're not going to be able to do that. You're not going to be able to raise the age. You're going to have to slash and burn. Because the problem with it is this idea that you're just going to kick the can down the road and print more money. You're going to make it even more worthless. When you print more of something, it becomes less valuable. That's why you can't make more gold. That's why gold is valuable. Anyway, $40 trillion is a number that is just, you can't even fathom that number. And I guess from the Foggy Dew's perspective, I guess the only thing you can really do is just watch the debt clock. And you really want to keep your eye on gold and silver prices. Gold and silver are going to the moon right now. I had a buddy of mine text me. He's like, well, you're going to get short-term cap gains. Dude, I have physical gold. I have physical silver. Own physical assets if you can, because there is a bomb coming. And I guess the only other thing you can really do is just, pray that this gets figured out. It's a very serious problem, and we just crossed a threshold that I don't know if there's any coming back from on the dead. But anyway, I guess we just got to pray, and we just all got to lean on each other to figure this out. So trust me, I'll be watching it. So switching gears, I saw this Trump Truth Social post that came out the other day, and it was worth commenting on. And I guess to frame this, do you remember the executive order that Trump put out regarding election integrity? Just to summarize it briefly, that EO, that executive order, broadly required states to produce their voter rolls. And what they were trying to do is they wanted those states to provide their voter rolls so the federal then could match that against what the Social Security Administration had. Because theoretically, the list should be the same, right? Like the federal government, the Social Security Administration should know who the citizens of the states are, and the states should be able to provide that information. The problem with that very simple dynamic, and I've talked about it on the show many times, is that 25 plus states in the union are refusing to provide their voter rolls. I just think that's such a stunning thing. I mean, here's the federal government giving these people money. You're taking my tax money. These states take tax money from the federal government that's provided by citizens, and then they're not in compliance with federal rules. They're required to turn that stuff over, and they're refusing to do it. So why don't you just cut them off? But either which way you break that apart, 25 plus states aren't providing that. And the second part of that executive order, if you look at it specifically, it talks about boundaries being created for mail-in balloting. The mail-in ballots that the executive order talks about, those mail-in ballots will be cross-checked and verified. Social Security Administration verifies who is an eligible voter or not and who qualifies for mail-in balloting. And then what would happen is that the U.S. Postal Service would then send secure mail-in ballots with like QR codes, chain of custody. The U.S. Postal Service would send those ballots out, and then the ballots would come back in through the UPS. And the thing that I thought was so brilliant about the executive order when he first did it is no new rule was created here. So it'll withstand constitutional scrutiny through Supreme Court. Donald Trump in this executive order created no new rule. What he did is all he's doing is he's saying, hey, this is existing federal law, and you states that are non-compliant, you need to get in line here. The federal government has supremacy in a situation like this. Voting is obviously a state's issue, but states have to meet minimum requirements for the federal. And the reason that Donald Trump had to do this is because the reason that Donald Trump had to do this executive order is because the legislature, Congress, and the Senate are sitting here fiddling around with the SAVE Act. The SAVE Act is theater. I've seen so many different permutations of how the Senate wants to get the SAVE Act attached to this bill. They want to do this. They want to do that. Absolutely none of it happens. How long have they been sitting on the SAVE Act? It's been at least 6 months. It's been at least 6 months, and it's talked about like it's some kind of like bolt out of the blue that the Senate is all of a sudden going to find a way to get this thing across the line. The Senate is sitting on this bill. They're not doing anything. It's just a bunch of hot air, and you have a totally useless person in John Thune that is sitting there defying the Republican base and, quite frankly, the Democrat base as well. This is an 80% consensus issue. And it's not just John Thune. It's Tom Tillis. It's Lisa Murkowski. It's all the usual rhino scumbags that are cutting the base off at the knees. But the thing that's interesting about what Trump does with the executive order, all the stuff that he puts out, Trump is telling you that we're going to have election integrity whether or not Congress passes it or not. He said that many times. And why am I talking about this? Why I'm talking about it is because somebody was texting me just the other day asking me about, like, where's this executive order at? The executive order now has conflicting rulings. There are now conflicting rulings that are sitting in the United States of America. If you remember, there was a judge named Sparkle Suidan. This Sparkle person was this judge that put a stay on the executive order. And if you'll remember, that Sparkle Suidan was a dual citizen of Trinidad and Tobago. She said it was unconstitutional for the federal to require the states to live up to minimum federal standards. It's not unconstitutional for the federal to require that a state, Sparkle. So she was the first roadblock to the executive order in the judiciary. Well, then what happened is that her ruling, Sparkle's ruling, was then overturned by a conservative judge. He said, no, this is constitutional and will proceed. So again, executive order cut. It's a stay is put on it by this liberal named Sparkle. Then it's overturned again. A conservative overturns it. Well, the problem with that is that Sparkle didn't like that all too much. And what she did is she reissued her stay on it. So what you have now, you have two conflicting rulings. Two orders are now in effect on this executive order. And I guess the good news with that paradigm, with the executive order stuck like that in this legal hellhole, is that now what's happening is that executive order is being fast-tracked to the Supreme Court. Because obviously you have a crisis of the judiciary here. And again, on top of all of this, you're talking about 25 plus states that aren't turning over their voter rolls. Well, the Department of Justice has started litigating with all of these states that are non-compliant. They sued them, which they should. Harmeet Dillon has been suing these states for non-compliance. And good. They should go in front of a judge and explain why they don't want to abide by federal law. But I guess the interesting thing to me when I look about all this is that Donald Trump, the FBI, the Department of Justice, they keep releasing info in like dribs and drabs of stuff about 2020. And 2020 really is the thing you got to think about when you think about election integrity, because in 2020, you had states stolen, you had fake ballots, bogus vote counts, you had bogus voters. It was just major chicanery in all of these states. So you have all of these moving pieces now in the body politic, moving pieces about securing elections. The general population is receiving information about how elections are stolen in the United States of America. And it's so interesting when I was thinking about this whole dynamic, everybody, I think with a functioning brain, has been watching this, even on MSNBC and CNN and places like that. Everyone in America was watching the Spencer Pratt deal in LA. Spencer Pratt got totally hosed. There was a drop of 24,000 ballots for the third-party candidate who's a communist. Spencer Pratt was in 33% and got zero of those. It's statistically impossible. The probability of him getting zero is in the trillions. You're seeing this in real time. And I guess my point with this is that you're seeing all of this bubbling up. You're seeing all of this activity occurring while we as a country are barreling headlong into November in the midterms. So to put a fine point on it, you have a deadline in November that is approaching fast. And I guess, again, why am I talking about this? Well, here's Donald Trump on Tuesday. He put out this True Social post. Here's Donald Trump on True Social. Quote, the Census Bureau has begun checking the voter records from 2020 against their citizenship records. On the first 128 million voters, the Census Bureau proves that over 24,000 non-citizens voted illegally. The Census Bureau is going to analyze the next 32 million voters, and this number will explode. I won the election. We must pass the Save America Act. Thank you for your attention to this matter, end quote. So I guess layman's terms, like you're hearing me read that, right? But layman's terms, what he's saying here is that the Census Bureau is now cross-referencing data. Well, the Census Bureau cross-referencing state data is the whole point of the executive order. That is the gist of the executive order. The gist of the executive order is that the state rolls match the federal rolls. What Donald Trump is saying in this Truth Social post is that the Census Bureau is cross-referencing voter records against citizenship records. They're checking it. And obviously, based on what he just said in this post, non-citizens voted in the 2020 election. Non-citizens voted, and they voted illegally. You had 24,000 bogus votes, and Donald Trump just put it out there for the world to see. And you might sit there and go, well, what's the big deal? It's a country of 330 million people. What's the big deal? It's just 24,000 people. Well, guess what? Joe Biden won the state of Georgia by like 10,000 votes in 2020. That's a determinative number, and it's all illegal and bogus. And I was reliably informed that it was the most secure election ever. And look, I'm not the brightest bulb here, but something is happening. There are way too many moving pieces when you're looking at election integrity, 2020, all the comments that are coming out, the FBI movement, the DOJ movement. The pressure here is increasing, and it should because we're coming up to the midterms. But the drops you see from the FBI, the DOJ, people like Donald Trump, these drops are absolutely surgical. They're all timed. And if you look at it, all the drops that they do, all the information that comes out, the executive order that is floating around in our judiciary right now, that executive order layers brilliantly on top of all of the information drops. All of the pieces are filled in. And if you take away the core of this, anybody with two eyes and a brain that's watching these drops and watching what's being said, you're seeing that 2020 was stolen. And that must be fixed. We cannot have non-citizens voting in our elections. And I guess let me just ask a general question. Do you trust half the states in the union anymore? Like, I don't. I don't trust California. I don't trust New York. I don't trust Illinois at all. How could you? How many illegals are running around in California right now? How many illegals are running around in New York? And the funny thing about all this is exactly why the Democrat Party and these DSA people, the Democrat Socialists, this is exactly why they hate the Electoral College. They want a popular vote winner. They want a popular vote winner because what they could do, California, that takes a month to count all their ballots, California could just wait until all the other states are counted and then just steal it with a massive dump of bogus votes. They're just going to round up as many illegals, non-citizen, foreign actors in states as they can find and try to shove it across the line in a popular vote. And again, if you read what Donald Trump, what the administration says, they're exactly correct in that voting, not just at the state level, but the federal level, that is a national security issue. So when I keep seeing stuff like this, the 24,000 people voted illegally, all of this stuff is converging. You have all of these disparate facts that are converging, and I have to believe that something pops here soon with this whole deal. Something has to give. And the thing I keep going back to in my own brain is if Donald Trump doesn't fix this situation, he's going to spend the twilight of his life in jail. Because if the Democrat Party gets back in, they win majorities in the House, Senate, God forbid they take the executive, Donald Trump and his family are going to jail. Because the minute a Democrat wins, it's over for Donald Trump. And I guess even if you go beyond the fact, even if you say, okay, Donald Trump doesn't spend the rest of his life in jail, If Donald Trump doesn't pull the trigger here and do something about securing our elections at this point, if he does not use the power of the executive to save the United States of America from a communist overthrow, he is going to go down in history as the guy that could have stopped the overthrow of the United States and didn't. So I guess the dynamic there, when you look at Donald Trump as a person, does Donald Trump want to be the immortal American hero, or does he want to be Neville Chamberlain? And I guess when I look at it, he keeps talking about 2028 and him being president a third time. And I guess my question is, at this point, is that a joke or is this serious? And the only thing I can look at is say, okay, well, if he's saying he wants to run in 2028, the only way that could happen in any planet where reality exists, the only way that could happen is if they prove with beyond a shadow of a doubt that 2020 was stolen. Because if 2020 was stolen, we are at war. We were dealing with an overthrow and a coup of the United States government. And at that point, you have drastic measures of presidential continuity, and national security would be at stake if something like that occurred. But I just keep watching all these little dribs and drabs that keep coming out in the media, and it's just interesting if you put all those puzzle pieces together. But either which way, November is coming fast. And we all better pray that this guy has an ace up his sleeve, because if they don't secure elections, we're in for a really long slog here. But anyway, I'll be watching it. So a quick topic that made me laugh out loud. Most people listening to this probably know who Eric Swalwell is. Eric Swalwell was a Democrat congressman out of California. I've talked about him on the show before. He was actually trying to run for governor of California until he was booted out. But Swalwell was initially elected to Congress in 2012. So this man served through Russiagate, COVID, all of these major events that happened in the last 15 years or so. But Swalwell specifically was a pit bull for the Democrat Party. He was always on CNN. He was always on MSNBC. He's just a pit bull for the party. Really what he was a foot soldier. He was a mouthpiece. He was a mouthpiece and a smear agent for every lie that was told about Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. He's just a brutal person. Well, and I mentioned a minute ago, he ran for governor this year in California. And what happened was he finally dropped out of the California gubernatorial race in April. And why did he drop? Well, it was very obvious that the Democrat Party forced him out. And the reason that they forced him out is because he was a political liability to the party. So what happened was, and the reason why he dropped out is all of a sudden, out of the ether, these photos emerged of sexual misconduct. He was like in a room with like these underage girls, like lewd photos of him in a hotel room with prostitutes or whatever it was. And if photos like that emerge after 15 years of bad behavior by this guy, I don't know much, but you can sleep easy knowing that the Democrat Party wanted him out. These photos don't emerge unless the Democrat machine signed off on it. And the way to think, he was jettisoned by the party because he outlived his utility. And with his utility fulfilled, this man resigned twice just April of 2026. He resigned from the gubernatorial race, and then he resigned from Congress, literally within a couple days. And you might be asking, why is this guy talking about Swalwell now? Because he's basically out of politics. Well, it had always been long rumored that Eric Swalwell was sleeping with a Chinese spy named Fang Fang. That's no joke. I mean, like, that's a legitimate news story. That information that Eric Swalwell was having sexual relations with a Chinese spy named Fang Fang emerged in an Axios article from 2020. Well, basic drips of that info. They painted kind of like this little. It was like a tiny little painting that like blew into a masterpiece. Like drips of that story all of a sudden became like rivers of information about Eric Swalwell and what he was really doing in US politics. And the thing I think is so interesting, it's almost like what happened in COVID. Like the MAGA ecosphere knew all about like COVID, right? And it's the same thing with this. The MAGA ecosphere knew all about Fang Fang. Eric Swalwell, Fang Fang, all of it was very well known and chronicled on places like X. And the reason I'm talking about it now is because on Monday, there were more FBI files that were dropped by the White House. This whole thing just blew my mind. The FBI had evidence that Swallwell was compromised for a long time. And here's the ironic story. The FBI suspected, this is how it started. The FBI suspected Eric Swalwell of taking illegal campaign money. This is like back in 2013, 2014. So basically what happened was the FBI thought that Swalwell was taking bribery money. They thought that Eric Swalwell was on the take. And he was. He was exchanging money with Fang Fang. So Fang Fang is giving him money for his campaign. So Fang Fang gives Eric Swalwell money. And then what Swalwell did to pay her back was he was installing like interns strategically in California politics. He's putting them in like the correct places. So the FBI saw this whole thing with this money going into Swalwell. They saw Fang Fang giving him money. They saw these interns being strategically placed that Fang Fang had signed off on. So what happened was the FBI approached Fang Fang. What they figured out when they approached her, they figured out that she was a Chinese Communist Party operative. They didn't even know when they approached her that she had already compromised Swalwell. Fang Fang was way deep already into this whole Swalwell with buying off Swalwell, and the FBI didn't even know it. Fang Fang was exchanging money, sex, drugs, all for access that Swalwell provided in intern placement. So what happened was the FBI goes to Fang Fang, they figure out this whole thing. So the FBI knows this whole scheme. They knew what was occurring in 2013, 2014. So they knew that this guy was taking money from a Chinese operative. He was putting these people in these positions. The FBI at that point declined to involve Swalwell in criminal prosecution. So what they did is they decided to go after Fang Fang. They didn't go after the scumbag congressman. And they didn't even go after her as a CCP operative. What they did is they went after Fang Fang for illegal donations to California politics. They're not even looking at the espionage part of this and what that really means to national security. And the crazy thing about it is the FBI drop that occurred on Monday, Swalwell is admitting all of this. Swalwell admitted taking money from a Chinese operative. He admitted to sex, drugs, rock and roll, all of it. He admitted to taking bribes. He admitted placing interns from the CCP in these sensitive locations. But again, he wasn't being pursued. Fang Fang was. So when the FBI turned their sights on Fang Fang, what happened was she fled the US. So this spy, a Chinese spy, flees the US, and the Department of Justice then declined to prosecute her after that because she was gone. You know who's in charge of that investigation? Who do you think was in charge of the DOJ investigation into Fang Fang? If you guessed Jack Smith, you'd be right. Remember that name, Jack Smith? Jack Smith was the prosecutor on that. That's the same Jack Smith that went after Donald Trump on bogus criminal charges. This is the same guy that was trying to jail a president of the United States. I'm reading this thing, and again, I don't even know why I'm surprised anymore. The FBI knew about this 10 years ago. You had a legit Chinese spy. You had a legit Chinese spy that compromised a U.S. congressman. Compromised him in a lewd manner too. Sex, money, drugs, all of it. And the guy admitted it. I don't care if it's a Democrat. I mentioned the ecosphere of media, right? MAGA, air quotes, conspiracy theory people. We've been screaming about this whole thing with Fang Fang for years. The mainstream media declined to talk about any of this, and now this whole situation is confirmed. And look, you can go on the White House website, go on the Department of Justice website. It's all there. Go look at it. And the thing that blows my mind about it is Eric Swalwell was not some bit player in Congress. He wasn't some Joe Schmo. This guy was the face of the Democrat Party going after the opposition. He wasn't just going after the opposition and being a Democrat pit bull. Eric Swalwell was a compromised politician who was on the Homeland Security Commission. What information was he giving to the Chinese Communist Party? Swallwell was the ranking member of Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Committee in Congress. Do those sound? Homeland Security Commission, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure. He was on those committees as a chair. And he was compromised by our enemies. This man was on the Judiciary Committee. He served on these committees after the FBI knew that he was compromised. And again, I just think you have the FBI, the Department of Justice, and scumbag Jack Smith doing absolutely nothing. The FBI knew that there was a CCP compromised politician and did nothing. And I guess my question is, what is the purpose of the FBI? What is the point of it? Aren't they supposed to take care of this? How did the FBI allow this man to stay in those positions? Why was he not arrested for treason? And I'm sitting here reading this story, and this is exactly why nobody believes anything anymore. Like, are you kidding me? And Jack Smith is kind of the cherry on top of this whole thing. It's perfect. He's the ultimate scumbag, the ultimate partisan hack taking down the government from the inside. And I guess the question, if you expand the scope here, which I like to do on the Foggy Dew, how many other people are compromised in our government? How many other politicians do the FBI know about that are completely compromised by our foreign adversaries? And then the next question you want to ask yourself is, how deep is the penetration of the Chinese Communist Party into American politics? The Chinese Communist Party has spies on our most sensitive committees in our Congress. And when people talk about like deep state and a shadow government, there you go. That's what it is. I mean, me as a citizen, if I did something like that, I'd be thrown in the deepest, darkest hole. But instead, a person like Swalwell was beyond the law. You had 6 to 10 years of Eric Swalwell, the lying traitor, lying to America. And now you know why the Democrat Party dumped them. Now you know why those photos emerged in the hotel, because they knew that this would come out. That's exactly why they jettisoned him. They knew that he was damaged goods. They had the photos. They allowed him to continue until his utility was expired. Because let's be honest, the Democrat Party is blackmailing the same way that the Chinese Communist Party is doing. They're saying, hey, Eric, we have all these photos. If you don't do exactly what we want you to do, we're going to show these photos and ruin your life. How's that any different with the Chinese? It's a mafia deal. And the other thing you want to think about with this, if Donald Trump was not elected, you would never know about this. And I guess my only point with this, however much you hate our government, it's not enough. I mean, I was fed a story like a fairy tale when I was a kid that the FBI is pursuing justice till the heavens fall. And it sure doesn't seem like that now, does it? And I guess when you look at a situation like this and you see this compromised politician with Chinese spies and all this other stuff that literally looks like a James Bond novel, small wonder that they could steal 2020. The mainstream media is asleep at the switch on all this stuff. They knew about this from Axios 6 years ago, and they're still just sitting on it. They stole 2020 in broad daylight. Nobody did anything about it. That's exactly why you have January 6th being completely fake. Nothing happens. This is exactly why Russiagate wasn't pursued. This is exactly why Anthony Fauci is walking around with a pardon. And look, Trump has a lot of faults. He has a lot of faults. I'm very critical of Donald Trump. But the reality is that his border closure was number one. But number two has got to be the exposure of the apparatus of government. It's like throwing sunlight on this. It's like somebody lifted up a rock and there's all these cockroaches under it. Donald Trump's the guy that flipped the rock over for you to see all the cockroaches. And I'm telling you this, if Kamala Harris had won or Hillary Clinton won in 2016, you would have been slowly strangled by your government. Because none of this would have ever been talked about. It would have been the next lie, the next lie, the next lie, the next lie. And again, I voted for Trump 3 times. That Trump at least gave you a chance to fix this, a chance to fix it. That doesn't mean it's going to get fixed, but at least he gave you a chance. This is just, it's absolute madness, but I wanted to comment on it. So switching gears, I've been thinking a lot about this whole Catholicism deal that I talked about earlier in the week. And to be totally clear and fair about all this, I've spoken to a priest about it because it's just very concerning to me. Like personally, this whole idea of a religion or a faith fracturing in half is just difficult for me to process. But I guess it's like a lot of things that sprang from COVID. I mean, you had families splitting in half, friends splitting apart, neighborhoods split apart. All the things that we looked at for the majority of our lives is like these concrete structures, these fixed points in the heavens, they all broke apart. And I guess the question is like, why would a church be any different? I mean, if families can fracture, isn't it reasonable to assume that the church would? The family is the microcosm of the church, right? But I think the way out of it, I think the thought about it is we have to look to history to try to figure this out and then work forward together because we have a shared history here. And that's the thing that's so beautiful. This fracturing isn't like 100 years old. It's only a couple years old. We have a shared emotion as people, as citizens, and that shared emotion is provided to us by history. And it really made me think. And the funny thing about this whole conversation or thought process is I had written a story a while ago that really fit neatly into this entire vein of faith, Catholicism, and all that stuff. And I wanted to go ahead and just share it because I thought it was appropriate. And I guess I'll start this, I don't know, diatribe or whatever you want to call it. I'll start with a guy named Benjamin Balk. On October 28th, 1778, in the middle of the American Revolution, Benjamin Balk reported for duty, and he reported to the USS Boston. You might be curious as to his role on the Boston. Well, he was actually the first chaplain of the U.S. Navy. So this Balk man served as a chaplain on the Boston until it was captured by the British in 1780. Well, so that was the Navy. So in 1791, so not long after, Congress actually authorized the position of Army chaplain. So they authorized this position, and that position was filled by a man named John Hurt. So John Hurt was the chaplain of the Virginia militia at the time, and then he was actually recognized as the chaplain of the Continental Army. So if you look at U.S. military history, Hurt was technically the first U.S. military chaplain. And what I think is so interesting, like if you look at these like baby steps of like chaplains in the military, it's interesting what these men's faith was. Both men were Protestants. The U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy only allowed Protestants to serve as chaplains when the country started. So only Protestants were allowed as chaplains, and that situation changed in 1846. 1846 was the end of the Mexican-American War, and what had happened was in that conflict that there were a large number of Irish people, German people, they fought for the U.S. in that conflict. Well, if you know anything about Irish people or German people, those soldiers that fought for America were largely Catholic. So after the Mexican-American War wrapped up, President Polk, who was the president at the time, he was lobbied for a change to this policy of only Protestants being chaplains. So Polk just looked at it and said, you know what, this does make sense. So at that point, 2 Jesuits or Catholics were then sworn in as military chaplains. Those men's names were John McElroy and then Anthony Ray. But those 2 men were the first Catholic chaplains. And I guess if you're looking at it, Protestants, Catholics, are you noticing a pattern here? Only Christians served as chaplains of the U.S. military and Navy for a long time. Lincoln finally allowed a rabbi to become chaplain. So in 1862, Rabbi Jacob Frankel became the first Jewish chaplain, so in the middle of the Civil War. So what you had at this point, when Lincoln did that and allowed this Rabbi Frankel in, the path now for all denominations to become a chaplain was now open in the U.S. military. And I think if you look at the position of chaplain broadly in the military, chaplains wear no rank. They have their denomination or insignia of their religious affiliation like a cross, a star, David displayed on their uniform. Chaplains are usually treated as officers in a military setting. And if you look at rank, because they really don't have a rank, but chaplains are normally captains in the Army, and they are lieutenants in the Navy. And you could look at any one of our conflict. Chaplains are all around. Chaplains were at Normandy Beach. Chaplains were at Anzio. Chaplains were at Iwo Jima. Chaplains were at Okinawa, at Peleliu. They were on the front lines with these men that were dying. And that's the stuff I look at, talking about shared history. These men of God stood in the fire of combat and they were unarmed. And I mentioned it the other day. These men truly walked into the lion's den with only their faith. And it's not just Catholics, it's Protestants, it's all these people. And I've never served in the armed forces, and I don't know much, but I do know for a fact that there are no atheists in foxholes. Because I would imagine, as somebody that thinks logically, that God was very real at a place like Omaha Beach. You could probably reach out and touch God. Because how many prayers were happening on Higgins boats? How many prayers were happening on Higgins boats when German bullets started snapping the front wall of that boat? There's no atheist on that Higgins boat when those German bullets start spraying against the wall. And I guess when you think about it, God is very real to mankind when death is near. And if you think about that paradigm and that dynamic, I think that is one of the problems with our society. And if you look at humanity historically, death was a constant companion of humanity forever. Death was always very near to mankind. You had war, you had pestilence, you had famine. Even things like childbirth, if you go back like 100 years ago, things like childbirth were possibly fatal to the mother. Mankind, in all of recorded history, was always very near death until the last 50, 60 years. Lifespans were shorter. Life was more difficult. And that's interesting because nowadays, in our modern society, nowadays people can cheat death. Modern medicine has extended life. Childbirth is a routine miracle now. You could even look at skin. People take care of their skin better. Lifestyle maintenance. People run weights. They eat well. They lift weights. Modern society broadly is no longer as close to death as previous generations. We evade death. We cheat it. So we create the illusion in our own brains that death is far away. And I think that false security, that death is like some kind of abstract, faraway construct, it allows people space to ignore God. I think it allows you to ignore the reality. If you think of death as some kind of abstract construct that'll happen way later in your life, if you ignore the reality of your own death, you're putting your brain in a bad spot. You're ignoring the reality that you're going to die one day. Because the facts of the matter is that eventually you are going to cross that barrier and you're going to meet your maker. And I think this thought process of evading death is why COVID was such a failure. Meaning the pandemic response. People nowadays in our society want an easy button. The vaccine was perceived as the easy button. It's almost like Ozempic. If you're overweight, running, diet, those are hard. People don't want to do hard. They want easy. So that easy button of Ozempic is what they turn to. But unfortunately, that easy button, it doesn't matter if it's the vaccine or Ozempic or whatever it is, that easy button is going to have side effects. But if you narrow back into this conversation about chaplains and the military, proximity to death has a proportional increase in belief in God. Like when somebody's sick, when somebody dies, what do? We send our prayers. We don't send prayers to people when everybody's healthy and happy eating a picnic in the park on a Tuesday afternoon. But if you look at combat, death is imminent. And when death is imminent, what happens? God is near. And when God is near, the role of the chaplain then becomes apparent. It's interesting to me, there are 3,529 people, Americans, that won a Medal of Honor. 3,529 medals of honor. 9 chaplains have won a Medal of Honor. 4 of those were awarded in the Civil War. 1 was awarded in World War II. That was the Navy. There was 1 in Korea. That was the Army. And there were 3 in Vietnam. There were 2 Army and 1 Navy in Vietnam. But it's interesting to me because I was talking about Catholicism. All 5 chaplains who won the Medal of Honor post-Civil War were Catholics. 2 of those 5 are actually in the process of canonization. They're becoming a saint. But one of those Catholics that won a Medal of Honor was a man named Emile Capone. So Capone was from rural Kansas. He became a priest in 1940. He joined the Army in 1944 as a chaplain. Well, Capone served in the Pacific. He was on the front lines in the Burma Theater. This man was the chaplain for 19,000 service members. Well, after that war ended, he went back to a sleepy church in El Paso, Texas, but the Army wasn't done with him. So in 1950, Capone was brought back into service and he was assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division and he was deployed to Korea. So Capone was there when the 1st Cavalry made the first amphibious landing on Korea on July 18th, 1950. He was part of that first wave. So Capone was in combat immediately in Korea. Well, within days of that amphibious landing, he had already shown incredible bravery. Injured soldiers were out in the open in one of the earliest firefights in Korea. Capone carried men to safety under heavy fire. That bravery in front of withering fire won him a Bronze Star. Capone was part of the American forces that were pinned in the Pusan perimeter. I talked about the Pusan perimeter just, a couple weeks ago? But Capone stood with the brave men at Pusan, and then he was part of the northward breakout when they finally moved out. This chaplain was part of the Pusan perimeter. He was part of the northward breakout. He helped push the Korean army back across the 38th parallel, and he was part of the forces that captured Pyongyang. This guy saw seriously heavy combat. Well, as the 1st Cav then advanced towards China, his regiment was engaged by Chinese reinforcements. Chinese reinforcements came to the aid of the Korean army, the KPA. Well, what happened is that 20,000 Chinese ended up joining the Korean army and engaged Capone and his comrades at a place called Usan. So these 20,000 fresh Chinese fighters engaged these guys, and Capone's regiment was forced to retreat. Well, unfortunately, you had all these wounded in these freezing conditions, so about 800 U.S. soldiers were caught in that retreat, and Capone was among them. He wouldn't leave. Well, as the Chinese Korean forces closed in on these 800 men, Capone saved nearly 40 men. He was carrying them to safety. He saved 40 men. He carried them back to the American lines. Capone won a Medal of Honor for his bravery in that act. But the problem with it is that unfortunately the remaining U.S. soldiers were captured by the joint Korean-Chinese forces. So these men, these 800 guys were captured. Now they're POWs. So they're POWs and they were marched north in the freezing cold, Capone among them. The Koreans marched these guys about 90 miles north. It's freezing out. Men were wounded and dying. They had malnutrition. They were cold. Lice is all over the place. So these men, they were ended up ultimately put in a POW camp. But Capone never quit. He never stopped. He was always working. He stayed positive. He dug latrines in the POW camp. He gave away his food. He tended to the sick. He gave a contraband Easter service while he was in captivity. So this man sat here and kept the spirits up of all of the prisoners of the Koreans. Unfortunately, this hero, Capone, died of malnutrition and a blood clot in a POW camp in May of 1951. I thought it was interesting when you look at a story about a guy like Capone, like all dead prisoners of that camp. Where do you think they buried those guys when they died of like freezing, exposure, whatever it is, malnutrition? They buried all these prisoners in mass graves. The only person in that POW camp that was not buried in a mass grave was Capone. His comrades, his brothers, his flock buried him in a single grave. He was the only man that got that. And that grave that he was put in was slightly higher than the mass graves that were next to it. The silver lining to that is that all of those remains, all of the remains after the Korean War, all of those remains of all of the prisoners were ultimately recovered. There were 1,868 brave men, POWs, that had died in these camps. They were brought home. They were all unidentified. They were all buried together. But I think the beautiful thing about that, all 1,868 men that were brought home, they were all buried at Arlington together. They will spend eternity together. And I suppose that's very fitting because they were together in life and they can stay together in death. That story just always kind of blew my mind. But since I'm on this topic, I'll remember another guy named Vincent Capodanno. So this Capodanno guy was from Staten Island. He was the son of an Italian immigrant. Well, Capodanno was ordained in 1958 and he was sent to Thailand to minister. So he's in Thailand watching what's going on in South Vietnam. He's seeing the situation unfold in South Vietnam. And what he did is he volunteered to join the Marines as a chaplain. So he served a full tour in 1967 with the 7th Marines. He did a full year in combat and then volunteered for a 6-month extension. I thought it was interesting looking at this story. This guy's best friend in Vietnam was actually Frederick Smith. And I don't know if you know who Frederick Smith is, but Frederick Smith actually went on to go found FedEx. But Capodanno was kind of an interesting guy. He had a few nicknames. One of his nicknames was Radiating Christ. That was one nickname, but the one that really stuck was the Grunt Padre. Well, on September 4th, 1967, the 5th Marines were attacked. The 5th at the time was operating in the Khe Sanh Valley. They were overrun by 2,500 NVA regulars. 3 other companies were sent in there to assist. So basically, the nuts and bolts of this is you have 4 companies of Marines tangling with this massive NVA force now. So Capodanno is back. He's behind the lines. He hears that one of the companies is about to be overrun. And what he did, he didn't sit back in safety. What he did is he rushed into danger. He rushed right to the front lines. He treated men. He gave them last rites. Capodanno was shot several times. So he's injured himself, but he refused to leave. Well, there was a wounded corpsman in an open field that Capodanno saw. So you had a wounded corpsman laying in a field. He's shot. He's screaming. Well, Capodanno broke cover to save that wounded man and tried to drag him back. So as Capodanno's dragging this guy back, he was cut down by machine gun fire as he was attending to this wounded corpsman. So he exposes himself to direct fire, trying to save another man's life. He's shot and killed. Capodanno was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1968. And I mentioned it a little bit earlier in this whole thing. Both of those men won Medals of Honor, and they're in the process of canonization. And again, why am I talking about these? These are total heroes. But the point of it is, and it's not just the fact that they're Catholic, but these are men of real faith. And I guess the question that I would ask anybody listening to this, do you see any of those men nowadays? And I get, do you see any of those people around you? Like these like stalwart faith guys? I don't. I don't see a guy that's just standing on business and talking about God and like not willing to give an inch. And I guess I was thinking about these 2 guys, like how would either one of these men respond knowing that like a Catholic governor signed a full-term abortion bill? And I'm pretty sure if you ask either one of those guys, a guy that fought in Korea, a guy that fought in Vietnam, I'm pretty sure that they would be aghast at what that woman did. But that strength, that moral strength and clarity, I think is sorely lacking in society today. Things like faith, devotion, duty, honor. Men like this didn't have shifting goalposts on morality. They knew right from wrong. And that is the church that I recognize. That is the faith that I aspire to. And to be fair, I don't think I'm alone. That strength of purpose, that strength of faith, that, hey, I'm not giving an inch here, I think that's the strength that people are broadly seeking. They want that. Because like these tepid, weak responses by faith leaders are not meeting the moment that our society has. Like when I look at like that Governor Healy, like the pastor of her church is a wet noodle. He's not a leader. A leader would say, hey, you did this, you're out. You don't just be wishy-washy about it. There's no strength there. That's not a leader. And I think this is partially why you see that trad movement. Trad means traditional. People want tradition. They want rules. They want order. Rules and order provide certainty in life. And personally, I want to know where people stand. And I guess that was why COVID was so interesting to me, because do you stand on faith when it matters? Because it mattered in COVID. If you allow a person like Healy to do something like this with full-term abortion, codifying abortion, are you going to fight for your faith? Or are you just going to be permissive of her behavior? And that's the thing that just blows my mind as somebody that works hard. Like, life is not easy or convenient. Life is hard, and so is faith. There isn't an easy button to faith, and there's not an easy button to life. And I guess if you ask me, like I mentioned a little bit ago, like, I don't think people think about death. And personally, I think about death all the time. I think about death all the time, but I don't worry about it. You know why? Because I'm prepared to meet it. And I think that's the whole point, isn't it? If you listen to the Foggy Dew, you know I keep a lot of quotes in my phone. And I have this quote, and I think it's so interesting. This is from Stonewall Jackson. I have a lot of quotes from Stonewall Jackson on my phone. He was a very devout Christian. Here's Stonewall Jackson, quote, "Captain, my religious belief teaches me to be as safe in battle as in bed. God has fixed the time for my death. I do not concern myself about that, but to be always ready, no matter when it may overtake me. Captain, that is the way all men should live, and then all would be equally brave," end quote. Well, there you have it. There you have it. God has fixed the time for my death. I'm not concerned about it. I just want to be ready when that moment comes. And I guess I'll kind of wrap this up. How we approach our death is really the only real choice anyone has. Like, if you ran away from COVID, you're running away from death. You're scared of it. And again, it's not how you actually die, it's how you approach your death. You could approach your death one way and then die a completely dissimilar way, right? And I guess this is my ethos, and this is what I did in COVID, and this is still how I live today. People can approach your own death any which way you want because it's your death. But for me, my choice, when I die, I want to die on my feet, and I want to die free. That's how I choose to meet my death. And I mentioned that maybe not how it happens. Like, maybe that's not how my death goes down, but that's how I plan on approaching it. I'm going to approach it with my back erect, standing on both feet, and I'm going to meet it bravely. That's my choice. That's how I choose to die. Again, I might die of cancer, and I might die in a bed, or whatever it is, right? But mentally, I choose to approach it a different way. And I'm sorry, I'm really just been thinking about it a lot. I've been thinking about all this with like a fractured flock and the strength that we need to move forward. We're going to need a lot of strength in the next few years, a lot. And I really hope faith leaders start meeting the moment. And I think you're going to start seeing that happen. Because the more dire the situation becomes, you're going to start seeing more and more guys step out. It always happens. And that's a good thing. And again, look, if you're a brave person in the clergy right now, take a look at the two guys I talked about. Take a look at the brave chaplains who lived their faith and were heroes, and they will live in history. Because those men, those people, those chaplains showed all of us what good looks like, and it's something we should emulate. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and wrap the show for the week, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed all this stuff about Catholicism. I've just been having a lot of heavy thoughts on it. So if you like the show, please go ahead and tell a friend about it. If you would, please follow us on Spotify. You can also follow us on Instagram at Foggy Dew Daily. If you have questions for the show, please go ahead and email us at foggydew95@gmail.com. But in the meantime, I'd ask you to say a prayer, ask questions, and stay vigilant. This is the Foggy Dew, signing off.